Loch Ness is the second largest freshwater lake in Scotland. It is 23 miles long. It is 755 feet deep at its deepest point.
Loch Ness is the second largest freshwater lake in Scotland. It is 23 miles long. It is 755 feet deep at its deepest point. For 90 years, the most hunted creature on Earth was not hiding in a jungle or lurking in the deep ocean. It was supposedly living in a single lake in the Scottish Highlands, visible from the road, photographed by tourists, and tracked by scientists with some of the most sophisticated equipment ever deployed on freshwater. And in 2018, a team of researchers finally found something. Not what anyone expected, not what anyone wanted. Something that answered the question and somehow made the mystery even stranger. Hi, my name is Matthew, and this is Reef Discovery. Who we are and why this story matters. And today we are going to do something that most Loch Ness videos refuse to do. We are not going to tease you with blurry photographs and dramatic music for 45 minutes before admitting we have no idea what is in that lake. We are going to follow the actual science, the actual evidence, and the actual discovery that researchers made when they finally applied modern molecular biology to the oldest monster mystery in the world. The answer they found was not a prehistoric plesiosaur. It was not a giant catfish or a massive sturgeon or a trick of the light. What they found was something that forced scientists to ask an entirely different question. Not what is in Loch Ness, but why do we see what we see? And those are not the same question at all. I have been obsessed with this story for a long time. Not because I believe in sea monsters, though I will admit that the 7-year-old version of me absolutely did and honestly still has opinions about it. But because the Loch Ness investigation is one of the most fascinating case studies in the history of science meeting human psychology. What happened in that loch and what scientists finally discovered when they looked at it correctly tells us something profound about how we understand the natural world and how badly we want that world to still contain surprises. This is the story they never quite told you. The real one. The one about a shepherd and a photograph and a geneticist from New Zealand standing at the edge of a Scottish lake holding 250 water samples about to change everything. The legend itself, what we think we know. Let us start with what you probably already know. Because the legend of Loch Ness is one of those stories so deeply embedded in popular culture that most people feel like they have always known it, even if they have never thought carefully about where it actually came from. Loch Ness is a freshwater lake in the Scottish Highlands, stretching roughly 23 miles from southwest to northeast along the Great Glen Fault line. It is not the largest lake in Scotland by surface area, but it is by far the deepest, plunging to 755 feet at its lowest point. To put that in perspective, that is deeper than the North Sea. The total volume of water in Loch Ness is greater than all the lakes in England and Wales combined. It is, in other words, a genuinely enormous body of water. Dark, cold, peat-stained to near opacity, and sitting on top of a geological fault that has been shifting and groaning for millions of years. The modern legend begins on the 2nd of May, 1933, when a local couple named John and Alda McKay reported seeing a tremendous upheaval in the loch while driving along the northern shore. The Inverness Courier published their account under the headline "Strange Spectacle on Loch Ness." That article, written by a journalist named Alex Campbell, who it should be noted would later claim his own sightings of the creature, set off something extraordinary. Within months, reports were flooding in from across the Highlands. Something was in the loch, something large, something that did not fit any known animal. Then, in April 1934, a London physician named Robert Kenneth Wilson published what became the most famous wildlife photograph of the 20th century. A long, graceful neck rising from the dark water, a small head tilted slightly, the suggestion of a massive body just below the surface. It looked exactly like what a prehistoric plesiosaur would look like if one had somehow survived 66 million years of extinction and chosen to reside in a Scottish lake. The photograph was reproduced in newspapers around the world. Nessie was born. What the world did not know and would not learn until 1994 was that the photograph was almost certainly a hoax. Christian Sperling, the stepson of a man named Marmaduke Wetherell, who had been publicly humiliated by the Daily Mail for submitting fake Nessie footprints the previous year, confessed on his deathbed that the photograph depicted a toy submarine with a sculpted head attached. The most iconic evidence for the Loch Ness Monster had been faked by a man with a personal grudge and a remarkable amount of free time. But here is the thing. By 1994, it did not matter. The legend had already taken on a life completely independent of the evidence that had created it. Decades of failure. Every expedition that came up empty. You would think that a fake photograph and 60 years of failed searches would have dampened scientific enthusiasm for Loch Ness. You would be wrong. The investigations that followed the 1934 photograph represent one of the most sustained deployments of scientific resources toward a single cryptozoological question in history. And I say that with absolutely no judgment whatsoever. If there were credible reports of an unknown large animal in a lake 23 miles long and 700 feet deep, any serious scientist would want to investigate. The problem was that every single investigation came back with the same answer, which is to say, almost nothing. In 1972, the Academy of Applied Science, led by Robert Rines, conducted an underwater photography expedition using strobe lights and sonar. They produced two photographs that appeared to show a large diamond-shaped flipper and what might have been a body. These images caused genuine excitement in the scientific community. The journal Nature published a paper about them. Sir Peter Scott, one of Britain's most respected naturalists, formally proposed a scientific name for the creature, Nesidaras rhombopteryx. Sir Peter was brilliant, by the way, and I feel obligated to mention that Nesidaras rhombopteryx is also a perfect anagram of monster hoax by Sir Peter S. I am not saying anything. I am just saying. In 1987, Operation Deep Scan assembled 24 boats equipped with side-scan sonar and swept the entire length of the loch in a coordinated grid. It was the most technologically comprehensive search of any body of fresh water ever conducted at that time. They detected 3 unidentified contacts at significant depth, objects larger than a shark moving independently. And then the contacts disappeared, and despite days of follow-up searching, were never found again. Through the 1990s and 2000s, underwater camera systems, remotely operated vehicles, and increasingly sophisticated acoustic monitoring were all deployed in Loch Ness. Documentary crews from every major broadcaster spent weeks or months on the water. A team from the BBC conducted what they described as the most exhaustive scientific survey of the loch ever attempted in 2003, using 600 separate sonar beams, sweeping the entire body of water simultaneously. They found no animal larger than a salmon. 60 years of searching, millions of pounds spent. Some of the best marine technology available brought to bear on one lake in Scotland. And the answer was consistently, overwhelmingly, maddeningly nothing. Which is precisely why what happened in 2018 was so significant. The man from the other side of the world. New clues are emerging on just what, if anything, is living in Scotland's famed Loch Ness. A scientist curious about the lake's fabled monster went looking for evidence. Neil Gemmell is a professor of genetics at the University of Otago in New Zealand, which means he is about as far from Loch Ness as it is geographically possible to be while still being on the same planet. He is not a cryptozoologist. He is not a monster hunter. He does not own a wetsuit emblazoned with the word expedition in large letters, which already puts him ahead of approximately 40% of people who have ever investigated this lake. He is a molecular ecologist who studies how genetic information can be used to survey ecosystems. And in 2018, he had a genuinely elegant idea. Every living creature sheds DNA constantly. Fish release it through their skin, their waste, their scales, the mucus on their bodies. As animals move through water, they leave behind a genetic trail as unique and identifiable as a fingerprint. This shed genetic material is called environmental DNA, or EDNA. And in the early 2000s, it became one of the most powerful tools in conservation biology. You could take a water sample from a river, extract the DNA from it, and identify every species that had been in that water recently, including species present in such small numbers that traditional surveys would never detect them. Gemmell's idea was simple and almost audaciously direct. Instead of trying to see Nessie, Instead of trying to photograph Nessie, instead of using sonar to detect Nessie, why not simply ask the water what was living in it? If there was a large, unknown animal in Loch Ness, it would be shedding DNA, and that DNA would be in the water, waiting to be found. In June 2018, Gemmell and his team collected 250 water samples from different depths and locations across the entire loch. They used sterile containers. They followed strict contamination protocols. Every sample was handled with the kind of care you would normally associate with a crime scene investigation. Because, in a sense, that is exactly what it was. They were looking for biological evidence of something that may or may not have left any trace at all. The samples were sent to 4 independent laboratories across the world for analysis. Each lab sequenced the DNA without knowing what the others had found. The results were compared for consistency. It took months, and when the findings came back, Gemmell prepared to announce them to the world at a press conference that, given the subject matter, attracted rather more attention than your typical genetic seminar. What the water actually said. Let us be precise about what the EDNA study found, because this is where popular reporting on the subject went badly wrong, and where the real story becomes genuinely fascinating. The study did not find evidence of a plesiosaur. Obviously, plesiosaurs have been extinct for 66 million years, and their DNA would have degraded into nothing long before any scientist could sequence it. The study also found no evidence of a giant shark, no evidence of a large sturgeon, no evidence of any exotic or unexplained large animal. For the purposes of the monster hypothesis in its traditional form, the EDNA study was another negative result. But here is what it did find. Eel DNA. An extraordinary, almost statistically improbable amount of eel DNA. European eels are common enough in Scottish lochs. Finding some eel DNA in Loch Ness would not be surprising. But the concentration and distribution of eel DNA in the samples was remarkable. It appeared across every depth level, every location in the loch in quantities that Gemmell described as off the charts compared to what you would expect from a normal eel population. Now, European eels are genuinely strange animals, and I want to take a moment here, because they deserve more attention than they usually get. They are catadromous, meaning they are born in the Sargasso Sea in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, migrate as larvae thousands of miles to freshwater rivers and lakes across Europe, spend decades living in those freshwater environments, and then when they reach sexual maturity, they migrate all the way back to the Sargasso Sea to breed and die. They have been doing this for millions of years, and scientists still do not fully understand how they navigate using magnetic fields, temperature gradients, and chemical cues across thousands of miles of open ocean with no map and no prior experience of a route. Eels are frankly more impressive than the monster they might be explaining. They are also capable of growing to significant sizes. The largest recorded European eel was just under 5 feet long. But here is where the eel hypothesis starts doing something interesting. Some researchers proposed that the EDNA concentrations were consistent with eels of exceptional size. Not 5 feet, not even 10 feet. We are talking about the possibility of eels in Loch Ness that could be significantly larger than any European eel in the confirmed scientific record. Giant eels, the kind of size where a dark, undulating body surfacing briefly in a peat black Scottish loch could absolutely plausibly be interpreted as a large unknown creature by a witness who had never considered that a fish could be that big. Gemmell himself was careful. He said the data was consistent with large eels. He did not say it proved giant eels existed. There is a meaningful scientific difference between those two statements, and Gemmell, to his credit, never blurred that line. But the question was now on the table in a way it had never been before. Not can eels explain the Loch Ness Monster, but could the Loch Ness Monster have always been eels? The skeptics fire back. Not everyone found the eel hypothesis satisfying. Not by a long stretch. The first problem is size. The largest confirmed European eel is under 5 feet. For an eel to explain the classic Nessie descriptions, the long neck, the humped back, the creature estimated by witnesses to be 20 or 30 feet long, you would need an eel of a size for which there is no confirmed precedent anywhere in the world. Giant eels are not impossible in theory, but they have never been documented at anything approaching the scale required. And science, unlike the internet, requires more than possibility before it updates its textbooks. Dr. Darren Naish, a paleontologist and science writer who has studied the Loch Ness phenomenon extensively, pointed out another problem. Eels do not behave like Nessie. European eels are secretive, bottom-dwelling animals. They do not typically surface dramatically. They do not raise their heads out of the water. They do not swim with the kind of visible neck and hump profile that witnesses consistently describe. The body plan of an eel, long, sinuous, flexible, does not naturally produce the silhouette that has been reported and sketched and debated for 90 years. There is also the matter of what eel reproduction in Loch Ness would look like. If there were a significant population of unusually large eels in the loch, you would expect to find them throughout the European eels range. You would expect reports from rivers and lakes across Britain, France, and Scandinavia. You would expect dead specimens washing ashore. You would expect something more than a concentration of DNA in one Scottish lake with no physical confirmation anywhere. Some researchers pushed back even harder, arguing that Gemmel's team had simply found evidence of a healthy and perhaps unusually dense eel population, nothing more, and that the leap from high eel DNA concentrations to giant mystery eels was exactly the kind of wishful interpretation that had plagued Loch Ness research from the very beginning. They had a point. Science has a long and not entirely glorious history of finding what it wanted to find in ambiguous data. The eel theory was compelling. It was also incomplete. And the thing it was most incomplete about was the witnesses themselves. The witness problem. What are people actually seeing? More than 1,000 sightings have been reported since 1933. And before you mentally categorize all of them as hoaxes, wishful thinking, or tourists who got overexcited after one too many whiskeys, let me tell you about some of the people making those reports. John Mackay, who filed the original 1933 report, was a respected local businessman with no obvious reason to fabricate a monster sighting. Father Gregory Bruzy, a Benedictine monk at Fort Augustus Abbey, reported seeing the creature in 1971 while walking along the loch shore with a fellow monk. He described it with a kind of calm, precise detail that does not suggest either hysteria or invention. A Royal Air Force pilot named Peter McNabb photographed what appeared to be two large humps moving through the water in 1955. McNabb was a trained observer whose professional life depended on accurately reporting what he saw. These are not credulous thrill seekers. These are ordinary, credible people describing something they genuinely could not explain. But the witness problem cuts both ways. Because when psychologists and perception researchers have studied the Loch Ness sighting phenomenon, they have found something uncomfortable. Human beings are extraordinarily bad at accurately identifying things they glimpse briefly in unusual conditions. We are pattern-matching animals. We see faces in clouds, figures in shadows, and animals in the ambiguous shapes produced by dark water, boat wakes, wind ripples, and light refraction. Studies on eyewitness reliability consistently show that confident, detailed, sincere accounts of observed events can be completely wrong. There is a specific perceptual phenomenon called pareidolia, the tendency to perceive familiar patterns in random stimuli, that is particularly powerful when the observer is primed to look for something specific. After 1933, every person who visited Loch Ness was primed. The legend was part of the landscape before they arrived. They were already looking for Nessie before they ever reached the water. Psychologist Christopher French, who has studied anomalous experiences extensively, has argued that the Loch Ness phenomenon is one of the purest examples of expectation-driven perception ever documented. The more famous the lake became, the more sightings it generated, not because the creature was becoming more active, but because the observers were becoming more primed. The feedback loop between legend and perception was self-sustaining and self-reinforcing. This does not mean all witnesses were wrong. It does not mean nothing unusual has ever been seen in that loch. It means that eyewitness testimony alone, no matter how numerous or sincere, cannot resolve the question of what is actually living in that water. And yet, 1,000 sightings is not nothing. 1,000 sightings demands an explanation, even if that explanation turns out to have nothing to do with a prehistoric reptile. The ground beneath the loch. The detail nobody talks about. Here is the detail that almost never appears in Loch Ness documentaries. Possibly because it requires explaining geology rather than showing dramatic underwater footage, but which may be more important to understanding this mystery than anything else we have discussed. Loch Ness sits directly on top of the Great Glen Fault, one of the most significant geological fault lines in Britain. This fault runs the entire length of Scotland from southwest to northeast, and is the reason the loch exists at all. The Great Glen is a fault valley carved out by millions of years of movement along the fault line, and that fault is not inactive. Loch Ness experiences minor seismic events regularly. Most are too small to feel, but they happen consistently, and they have been happening for as long as the loch has existed. And when you have seismic activity beneath a deep lake, you get something that almost nobody has ever considered in relation to the Nessie phenomenon. You get gas. Decomposing organic material on the loch floor combined with seismic disturbance produces bubbles of methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide that rise from the sediment and travel upward through 700 feet of water. By the time these gas columns reach the surface, they can produce a significant and sudden disturbance, a large upwelling, a dark shape breaking the surface, a visible hump of water and turbulence that appears from nowhere and disappears in seconds, leaving nothing behind, no wake, no animal, no explanation that a witness standing on the shore could easily formulate. In 1979, a researcher named Luigi Picardi presented evidence that at least some ancient monster sightings across the world correlate geographically and temporally with known fault lines and seismic activity. The correlation for Loch Ness is notable. Many of the most dramatic reported sightings from the northern shore of the loch correspond spatially with areas directly above sections of the fault line known to produce minor seismic activity. There is more. The peat content of Loch Ness water is extraordinarily high, which is why the water appears almost black at any significant depth. This peat content means that anything large moving near the surface would create a dark, ambiguous silhouette against the sky that would be extremely difficult to identify accurately from ashore. A large gas upwelling, a boat wake bouncing off the steep block walls, or even a large eel moving near the surface would, in the dark peaty water of Loch Ness, look genuinely strange to anyone watching from a distance. The loch floor itself is not flat. Sonar surveys have revealed a complex underwater landscape of ridges, trenches, and submerged shelves. Some sections of the floor have never been fully mapped. The deepest point, those 755 feet, sits in a depression that sonar has only partially characterized. We know the shape of Loch Ness less well than we know the surface of Mars. That is not an exaggeration. That is a documented fact. The geology of the loch is not just a backdrop to the mystery. It may be one of its primary authors. The answer that shocked everyone. So, here is where we bring it all together. And the answer is not what anyone wanted. There are large eels in Loch Ness. Probably not 30-foot monsters, but possibly, based on the Edna evidence, eels significantly larger than anything in the confirmed scientific record. Animals large enough, when glimpsed briefly at the surface in poor visibility, to produce a genuinely startling sight. Animals whose dark, sinuous bodies moving through peat black water could produce exactly the kind of brief, confusing visual experience that a witness would later describe using the only reference point available to them, the monster they had already heard about. Alongside the eels, the loch's seismic activity produces gas release events that create surface disturbances with no animal explanation whatsoever. A sudden upwelling, a dark shape that rises and falls, ripples moving against the wind in a way that looks directed and purposeful and alive. And layered over all of this is the factor no sonar sweep could ever detect: the human mind operating in a landscape saturated with expectation. Every person standing on that shoreline is already hoping to see something, and the human visual system, presented with ambiguous stimuli in high expectation conditions, will fill in the gaps every single time. This is not stupidity. This is not dishonesty. This is how perception works for everyone. The answer that shocked everyone is not that there is a monster. It is that there does not need to be one. When Gemmell was asked directly whether this meant there was no monster, he said he could not prove a negative. He could not stand at the edge of that loch, stare down into 700 feet of dark water, and tell you with absolute certainty that nothing extraordinary was down there. And honestly, that feels more truthful than any definitive verdict ever could. What the monster actually gave science. Here is what the Loch Ness investigation gave science that has nothing to do with monsters. And this is the part of the story that genuinely does not get enough attention. The 2018 Edna study was the most comprehensive freshwater biodiversity survey ever conducted on a single body of water at that time. Gemmell's team identified over 5,000 species in Loch Ness, including species that had never previously been recorded there. The methodology they refined and validated in Loch Ness, partly because the high-profile nature of the project attracted funding and scrutiny that would not have been available for a routine ecological survey, has since been adopted by conservation organizations worldwide. When you want to know whether an endangered species is still present in a river system without the expense and disruption of physical surveys, you use Edna. When you want to detect invasive species before they establish populations large enough to cause damage, you use Edna. When you want to monitor fish populations in large lakes without nets and trawls that stress the animals and disturb the habitat, you use Edna. The Loch Ness Monster effectively funded and legitimized a methodology that is now protecting real, documented, ecologically critical species from real, documented threats. The monster brought people to the loch. The science they brought with them turned out to matter in ways nobody predicted. There is something almost poetic about that. A 90-year-old hoax built on a toy submarine, and a grudge inadvertently catalyzing one of the most important advances in freshwater conservation biology of the past 2 decades. I do not say things are poetic very often, but that qualifies. The dark water still keeps secrets. I want to tell you something I have been thinking about since I started working on this script, because I think it matters more than the eel DNA or the fault line or the perceptual psychology. 90 years of searching for the Loch Ness Monster is often framed as a story of human gullibility. All those people, all that money, all that sophisticated equipment deployed in pursuit of something that was never there. A monster that was a hoaxed photograph and wishful thinking from the very beginning. A story that we should be embarrassed to have taken seriously for so long. I do not see it that way. I think the Loch Ness story is actually about something admirable in us. The refusal to accept that the world is fully cataloged, fully explained, fully mapped. The stubborn insistence that somewhere in the dark water there might be something that does not fit our categories. Something ancient and enormous and real that has simply been clever enough to avoid us. That impulse is not foolish. That impulse is the same one that drives every genuine scientific discovery. The belief that what we know is not the limit of what exists. The Edna study did not kill the mystery. It deepened it. Because now we know there are likely eels in that loch that are larger than any confirmed specimen in the scientific record. We know the loch floor contains geological features that produce surface phenomena we do not fully understand. We know that over 1,000 people, many of them credible, educated, and entirely sober, saw something in that water that they could not explain. The most complete answer science currently offers for Loch Ness is large, unusual eels plus geological gas events plus human perception operating in high expectation conditions. That is the answer. That is what shocked everyone, not because it confirmed a monster, but because it turned out to be genuinely stranger and more complicated than simply saying the whole thing was nonsense. Nessie is not a plesiosaur. Almost certainly, probably, definitely. But whatever is in that loch, the dark water is still 755 feet deep at its lowest point, still peat black at any significant depth, still sitting on top of a fault line that shifts and groans beneath it. The Edna from those 250 water samples captured the genetic traces of over 5,000 species. Gemmell's team sequenced every sample. They analyzed every fragment of biological material those samples contained. And they still do not know what those 3 sonar contacts were in 1987. The ones that moved independently at significant depth, larger than a shark, and then simply disappeared. Maybe it was a large eel. Maybe it was a gas bubble rising from a fault. Maybe it was instrument error or a thermal layer deflecting the sonar beam. Or maybe, just maybe, the loch is keeping one more secret. My name is Matthew. This is Reef Discovery. And that question right there, that stubborn, uncomfortable, unresolved question, is why we are all still standing at the edge of that dark water, looking down, wondering,